This lesson here, 7, you thought we never get out of lesson 6. I know you thought this is where we're going to die at in lesson 6. But we finally get through lesson 6 in the territory of the scriptures that we've covered, a lot here covered. I don't know about you, I feel like there's so much there, and it's like hard to restrain not to cover things sometimes. So this morning we're going to talk about, as you see here, this layout I've done for lesson 7. I've split it 3 ways here, of course. Try not to go any further than 3 ways, because I think the emphasis is going to be on Saul this morning, of course, and then David, and then we're going to talk about Solomon, the last of this lesson 7 here. So lesson 7 is divided in 3 here for you. So that's the plan this morning. Because these 3 kings, interesting, the 3 kings, these first 3 kings of Israel, how important it is. Because after this, what happens after these 3 kings? Anybody know? If you got the diagram, you already know the answer. Pardon? Yeah, but what happens after Solomon? Divided kingdom. The kingdom splits up. So that's something you have to chance. A challenge that took place, and we'll get to that as well, in the multitude of kings that follow after that taking place. But this is the layout this morning. The rise of the kings. This is a quote here I thought was really interesting. There's 2 quotes in here, one from David Cloud and one from the handout that you got. Now, let me explain something about that handout you got. One, it says 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Chronicles. It's like a layout of each book. I got this from Nelson's book of charts and tables. Well, it says book of maps and charts is where it's from. And I'm allowed to make copies of it, and I'm allowed to give it out, because that's what they allow you to do in Sunday school class. You're allowed to do that. So that's why you have that with you. I think they're a good overview, before I get to this opening here. That's a good overview of each one of these books. Because we're kind of covering these books, these particular books, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and Chronicles, and how they tie together. Because you'll be all over these 6 books here, really, that we're going to be going through. And not in real detail and everything. But I like that handout there, and that's what I gave to you. So you might want to keep that as a reference to look at as we go through. But here, back to this point here about the beginning of Kings here. A large portion of God's word is devoted to the history of Israel's kingdom, as you see there. And it says from 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we'll talk about 1 Samuel chapter 8 here in a moment, about when they asked for a king. Okay? When the people asked for the king, to the end of 2 Chronicles, the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians, okay? That's what Dr. Cloud talks about. There's 159 chapters covering that whole time span of the events taking place. The next point here is the book of 1 Samuel describes a transition. And it is a transition, because what did we just cover? What did we just cover? The time period of what we just covered. Pardon? The judges. Now we're transitioning over to the kings here, okay? The transition of leadership in Israel from the judges to the kings. 3 characters are prominent in the book. Samuel, who's the prophet of Israel, and he's the last judge. Saul, the first king of Israel, and then of course of David. Now David is also mentioned in 1 Samuel, but he is mostly in 2 Samuel when we deal with David here. So in here, we're not going to talk about Samuel himself. I'm not covering, because we talked about the judges, and he's a very prominent, let's put that, a very prominent judge with Samuel, of course, very instrumental in this thing about the kings, starting of the kings taking place, and we'll talk of that here in a second. So the background here, the request for the kings in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So hopefully in 1 Samuel chapter 8, if you're there. The first part of Samuel, chapters 1 through 7, and the book of Samuel deals with Samuel the prophet, his birth and all that. And I'm not covering all the birth of Samuel and all that. Very instrumental, I know, but I'm pushing that to the side here. But he's in part of this, dealing with Saul and dealing with David, the anointing of David, okay. But with 1 Samuel chapter 8, you're going to see here, it says, the note here, Israel eventually grew tired of the judges and requested a king. They wanted a king. Okay? The Lord's perfect plan for Israel was that the king would be a vassal king under his rule, under God's rule. Now let me ask you, well, you'll see this next point. No need me asking, you'll see it in the next slide here in a second. They've been under God's rule, really. And it's called a theocracy. Okay? Let me go flip. We'll go ahead and flip to that now. That's a little bit later on. A request for the king. Let's stop at this part here. Theocracy is what they've been in. We'll talk about what a theocracy is if you don't know. So for here, 1 Samuel chapter 8, if you turn 1 Samuel chapter 8, it says, "And it came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of the firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abiah. And they were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes, and perverted judgment." Corrupted, weren't they? Not following the Lord, were they not? Not like their father, who followed the Lord from the time he was put to serve under Eli, the judge of Eli, of course, not like Samuel. And then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, "Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." How do you like that feeling? And Samuel's been a judge for many, many years. And now he's up in age and say, "You're old. You're old." Don't you like that? Somebody come, "You're old." Yeah. You love when people, "You're old." Well, I didn't think I was, but I guess I am. You're telling me now I am old. But they told him he was old, and it's like, "You're old. We need to move on and we want to be like the rest of the nations out there. We want a king." Because they saw what? They saw his sons could not be judges. They were corrupted judges at that. And it says here, they want to be like all the nations. Isn't it interesting they want to be like all the nations? And what was the problem with all the nations? All those nations out there, what was the problem with them? Idol worshiper, whatever, false gods, what they did. Because we kind of like what they are doing and how they run things. Instead of focusing on, "Lord, what do you want done? What should we do?" Instead of going talking to the Lord about this. But if you see in verse 6, it says, "And the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, and howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them." In other words, listen to what you're going to give them a king, but you're going to give them some information about being a king, what's going to involve having a king. You're going to protest and let them know. They got to know what they're asking for. Okay? Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and shew them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked him of a king. And he said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots and for his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over 50s, and he will set them to ear his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his instruments of war and to instruments of chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, and even the best of them, give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants and your goodliest young men and your asses and put them to his work. And he will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you that day. And what did the people say? Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, go ye every man unto his city. Interesting. He lays out to them. Did you ever notice something in this whole thing that he talks about the king? One key word that kept showing up. He will take. He's going to take from you. He's going to take your sons, your daughters, your maids. He's going to take your lands. He's going to take from you. You're going to give those things to him, and you're going to be a servant to your king. So he's trying to lay that out for them to understand this. I don't know if it's, I think it was in this part here. Let's go through the next part. God warned them that they would become servants to the king. We just read that part in 1 Samuel. They were going to be servants to their king. This was fulfilled in 1 Samuel chapter 14, and all the references there. Even though they were warned of the consequences, the people insisted they wanted a king to rule over them. You just saw that. They still want a king. They want this. Before this, Israel was a theocracy, and the Israelites had great personal freedom, and they did have great personal freedom. Because how did they function earlier? Yeah, they came under judges, and they had judges because of why? Because they would sin, and then the Lord would give them a judge to help them along. But they didn't follow the things they should have done. Like following their priests. Remember when they were given cities of refuge. The Levites were given their cities throughout the land, and I told you when those cities of Levites were put there to do what? They were there to help them about the word of God, to help the people. The priests were scattered throughout the land, their different cities, to help them. But they kind of just like pushed that all aside. They kept pushing it aside, everything about God. Because at different times, as you saw in the book of Judges, what did they do? They were conquered by people because of why? 3-letter word. Sin. They refused. They wanted to worship other gods and whatever they might, and all kinds of things that you should have seen in the book of Judges that kept going on with them. It didn't just happen in a couple of years. It happened over that time period, the book of Judges. 450 years they dealt with judges, with all of that going on. That constant going on, of refusing to listen to the word of God and doing it their own way. Because that phrase that you heard in the book of Judges, every man did that that was right where? Their own eyes. Doing it their own way. So they dealt with that, and God tried to give them a judge to help them, and still they kept doing wrong and wrong and wrong. So now they're wanting a king.
They were enticed by the other things of the world. They were enticed by, how the other nations lived and what they had. And, they followed their own hearts and they followed their flesh. And people still do that today. And the churches still do that today.
Yeah, definitely. We see that happening in churches with people. This church is doing this. Why don't we do it like that? Is that the way the Lord wants it done? What does the scripture say? How it's done. And that's a good point here. True freedom is only found in God's will. When men do not submit to God, they become slaves. So moving on here, theocracy. In case you don't know what the word theocracy means here, that's why it's used here, because on that timeline I've given you time and time again, of course, the timeline of Old Testament history that you've had, you'll see it has divisions over the very top of it. It says theocracy, it says monarchy, and all the dependency across the top of that thing. Well, it's going to be shown here in a moment. But theocracy. The word theocracy is not a biblical word. You won't find it in the scriptures. It means God ruled. God desired to exercise his rule directly at first and then indirectly later through a king. When the theocracy worked as God intended, he was the ultimate ruler, the great king. He exercised ultimate rule over Israel's judges and later over the kings. The judges and kings evidently evidenced loyalty, allegiance, and obedience to God since they were his vassals in the treaty partnership. Think about when Moses was in charge. Moses was in charge, but who was really in charge? The Lord was in charge. Moses went and talked to the Lord about stuff. The Lord gave him the commandments, gave him the rules, gave him the instructions they had to have, and he relayed that down to the people. And they looked to Moses as a leader. But the Lord was the one they was in theocracy. He was the one taking care of them. He was the one leading them and all that. Joshua, the same way. They had a leader, but it was under the Lord's rule and all of that. Okay? So moving on. Hopefully you got that timeline there, and if you got it in your hands already, I tried to put this dotted line on my sheet here to show you the flip side of that page that you have, we're going to talk the other part a bit in a second about the three kings. But, you got Saul, David, and Solomon in this time period here. I want you to see it's the United Kingdom here. And right up there is the theocracy. Now we go into a monarchy, and later on it goes into a dependency. I want you to know, and I think I've said this before, I didn't come up with this original layout here. I'd gone to a school in Central Baptist many years ago, and Brother Hodges was my instructor, and he laid this out. And I thought it was the coolest way to understand Old Testament history and the layout of this. So I've kind of taken that and built on it, but I wanted you to know initially Brother Hodges, Earl Hodges did this, laid it out. So this part right here, I took this part here about the kings, and that's on the other flip side of your sheet there. I tried to lay out here to you, if you haven't already seen this before, about when the books of the scriptures were written, about timeline when they're written. You're going to know that if you see 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, about this time period, 1st, 2nd Kings, and then Chronicles is down here, about this time period when they were written, okay? So it kind of gives you a perspective. I don't know about you, I like seeing a perspective about things that go on. Here's the flip side of that. If you've already flip side your paper there, you should have seen this. You got Saul, got David, and got Solomon, the three kings, of course. Each one ruled for 40 years. And I put down the references here for 40 years where the scriptures talks about their 40-year reign. And this is the references to them. So this is like 1 Samuel chapter 9 through 31. This is 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, Chronicles, and the chapters and verses that deal mostly with these kings and the background to them. Okay? Any questions about that? So keep that in mind. For next week, we're going to talk about David, okay? We're dealing with him, Lord willing. That's the plan. So Saul's selection. 1 Samuel chapter 9, we'll be over to there in a second here. Saul's selection. God chose Saul in a response to the people and as a lesson to the people. He was a prominent family. So look in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, and the son of Zerah, and the son of Bacharach, and the son of Apha, and a Benjamite, mighty man of power. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man, and a goodly. And there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. He from the shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. So he was a tall person. He was from a prominent family. So he stood out, of course. Physically, he stood out, and stood out because of his family. Okay? And as the note here says, men usually choose leaders based on appearance and situation. They choose people like how they look, how they appear, how they carry themselves sometimes. Okay? And rather than asking the Lord, what is your direction? What do you want done? You know? Saul was privately anointed king by Samuel in chapter 10. We're covering 1 Samuel, but we're going to cover some quick pieces here. And you're going to say, well, you didn't talk about this, didn't talk about that. We're going to skip a lot of part because I'm trying to focus on Saul, this part here, for you. So in chapter 10, 1 Samuel chapter 10, it says, Then Saul took a vial of oil and poured it upon his head and kissed him and said, Is it not because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain over his inheritance? And moving on from there, in chapter 10, look down there, see the note there, it says chapter 10, verses 17 through 24. Going down the chapter here. And Samuel called the people together unto the Lord in Mizpah, and said unto the children of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt. Now let me stop there for a second again. I've said this before, and you probably could remember it, and I kind of emphasize that again. And the Lord emphasizes this several times about what he has done for Israel in bringing them out of Egypt. This is, I told you before how he has talked about this time and time again. He keeps reminding them that the Lord's the one who brought them out of Egypt. This group here, these people that are living right here, they're like how many years difference from the time Egypt, the Exodus? A lot of time, right? Because the time of Exodus, remember those people died in the wilderness for 40 years, and now you got the judges taking place 450 years. So it's a bit of a time span, but God still remind them that he's the one who brought them out of Egypt, where they came from. So down here at this verse again, 17, where I'm at, 17, 18. And said unto the children of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and deliver out of the hand of the Egyptian, and out of the hand of all kingdoms, and of them that oppressed you. And you have this day rejected your God, who himself saved you out of all your adversities, and your tribulations. And ye have said unto him, Nay, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. And when Samuel had caused all the tribes of Israel to come near, in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 20, to come near, the tribe of Benjamin was taken, and he had caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by their families. The family of, I'm going to skip down through here. Go all the way down. Let's keep moving down to verse 24. And Samuel said unto all the people, See ye him whom the Lord hath chosen? And there is none like unto him among all the people. And the people shouted and said, God save the king. Then Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom, and wrote it in a book, and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. I know I skipped over Saul here. When verse 21, Saul the son of Kish was taken, and when they had sought him, he could not be found. So they found David. He pointed out, and Saul had already been anointed. We already talked about it, been anointed earlier, but now he's presented to the people. And they say what? Save the king. He is our king. This is our new leader. We're going to follow him. Okay? During Saul's reign, when Saul came to office, his major task was to unify the tribes into a true nation. Samuel's efforts had contributed significantly for he had rescued the tribes. Real quickly is that what happened when, remember the time of the judges they had gone through? I know I briefly touched on it in the book of Judges, but they almost wiped out a whole tribe. They had civil war and almost wiped out the tribe because of horribleness that took place with the Levites' concubine. It was almost wiped out. That happened in the time of Judges, but Samuel's also part of the time of the Judges, and Samuel's in charge as well, and still trying to keep the nation together, to work together, here's the tabernacle, to serve together at the tabernacle. Still a challenge here. Saul is now the king, and Saul is in charge of what? The 12 tribes now, together, and trying to work with them. But if you see here, the tribes, however, were still separate entities with deep-seated differences between them. Jealousies of the past and even intertribal warfare were not easily forgotten. It wasn't too long ago when they had that civil war among them, so that divisions were still there. So now he is stepping on the scene to be their leader. The next point here, if you look, even more serious was the capture of the ark, the ruin of Shiloh, and the necessary transfer of the tabernacle to Nob. The ark had been returned to the land and not to the tabernacle at Nob. Without it, the tabernacle exerted little of the centralizing influence intended. The tabernacle was supposed to be the center focus of their religion and for their beliefs, of course. This passage is here in 1 Samuel. I know we jump around here, but it's the way it's laid out. What happened to the Philistines? They got in a fight with the Philistines. The Philistines had taken the ark away. The ark was away for like 7 months. Then finally the Philistines say, hey, we got to get it out of here. And so they send it back on a cart, and they send it back to Israel. And when it goes back to Israel, if you see in chapter 6, it says, and the ark of the Lord was in the country, chapter 6, 1 Samuel 6:1 says, and the ark of the Lord was with the country, in the country of the Philistines for 7 months. In chapter 7, 1 Samuel 7:1, it says, and the men of Jeram came and fetched up the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Abdi in the hill and sanctified Eleazar the son to keep the ark of the Lord. And it came to pass while the ark abode in Jeram that the time was long, for it was 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. It did not go back into the tabernacle. It stayed at this location for 20 years. I don't know. I don't understand why. I don't know the answer to that. Why it stayed in this place for 20 years before it was moved again. Saul embarked on his reign being empowered by the Holy Spirit. 1 Samuel chapter 11. 1 Samuel chapter 11, he had to fight the Ammonites. Then Nahash, the Ammonite, came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said unto Nahash, make a covenant with us, and we will serve thee. Isn't it easy to say, hey, we don't want to fight. We'll just be your servants. Just make a covenant with us. And Nahash the Ammonite said unto them, on this condition will I make a covenant with you, that I may thrust out all your right eyes and lay it for a reproach upon all Israel. And the elders of Jabesh said unto him, give us 7 days respite, that we may send messengers unto all the coast of Israel. Then if there be no man to save us, we will come out to thee. Interesting proposition here, I guess you want to call it. So 7 days they were given, of course, that went out, and of course Saul comes to help and raise up an army to help them there. Then came the messengers in verse 4 unto Gibeah of Saul, and told the tidings in the ears of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept, because one of their people were going to be subject to the Ammonites. And behold, Saul came after the herd out of the field, and Saul said, what aileth the people that weep? And they told him the tidings of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard these tidings, and his anger was kindled greatly. And he took a yoke of oxen and hewed them in pieces, and sent them throughout all the coast of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, whosoever cometh not forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done unto his oxen. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent. And with number of them in the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. He sure got a message out real quick and got an army together to fight this. The point here down at the bottom, it says, from that day forth Saul fought continually. And it talks about in this passage here, he fought continually here. He had the victory of the Ammonites, but he still had to fight. When we talk about Saul and to David and Solomon, you're going to see that Solomon didn't fight anybody. There's no wars with Solomon here, because Saul had battles to deal with. David took battles to conquer land and to subdue the enemies. But when you get to Solomon, there's a time of peace for them, for sure. His disobedience. Saul was plagued by disobedience. Now, he's the leader, but he has disobedience in his life. Early in his reign, he disobeyed God by making an unlawful sacrifice to the Lord. So 1 Samuel chapter 13, if you're not there already, 1 Samuel chapter 13. 13 and verse 8 down here. Well, he was told by Samuel to go this place and to wait 7 days. To wait. And in verse 8 it says, and he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, guess who shows up? Samuel shows up. Behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, and that he might salute him. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal. And I have not been supplication. I have not made supplication to the Lord. I forced myself and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. And now would the Lord have established the kingdom upon Israel forever. Excuse me. And now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not what? Has not kept that which the Lord commanded him. He did something, like you said, Terry. He did what a priest is supposed to do. And he's not a priest. He was the king. He was not supposed to do the sacrificing. And Samuel was to do that. Samuel was to get there, and Samuel was to take care of that. But what did Saul do? Besides doing that, what else did he do with this whole situation?
He lays blame on other people, and he lays the blame on different things. But he also,
Yeah, we'll get to that one. That's a different situation. Amalek's. He gave excuses. Trying to give excuses for why he did what he did. There was not legitimate excuses. Oh, the people were leaving and you weren't here, and just all these excuses to do on. Finding some kind of excuse. And he says, I did it reluctantly. I didn't really want to do it, but I did it anyways. All these excuses. Being disobedient and having excuses doesn't, you're disobedient. And with that disobedience led to what? Samuel said, the kingdom is not going to be yours. It's going to be taken from you. Moving on. He makes a rash vow with his soldiers, his military guys in chapter 14 here. 14 in verse, I think I've written down here. Just get my notes here. Chapter 14, verse 24. And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had adjured the people, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged on my enemies. So none of the people tasted any food. They had already been in battle. His men had been in battle, and he had already said, nobody can eat anything for the day. Well, his son Jonathan wasn't there. If you see, so look in chapter 14, verse 24. We just read that part. But chapter 14, verse 25. And all they of the land came to a wood, and there was honey upon the ground. And when the people were come into the wood, behold, the honey dropped. But no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan heard not when his father charged the people with the oath. Wherefore he put forth the end of the rod that was in his hand, and dipped it in the honeycomb, and put his hands to his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened. Then answered one of the people and said, Thy father straitly charged the people with an oath, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food this day. And the people were faint. They hadn't eaten. But here, David didn't. Jonathan had not heard of this, and he tasted the honey. Of course, if you look down in verse 44, where's it, verse 44? No, verse 43. And then Saul said to Jonathan, Tell me, what hast thou done? And Jonathan told him and said, I did but taste a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, and lo, I must die. And Saul answered, God do so, and more also, for thou shalt surely die, Jonathan. And the people said unto Saul, Shall Jonathan die, who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid. As the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has wrought with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, that he died not. Interesting, an oath here, a rash oath that was illogical, didn't make sense for the people, and yet he was going to take his own son's life. It was good that the soldiers stood up against Saul and said, he should not, he's helped us. Jonathan has helped us out. Don't do this. And they saved Jonathan's life, of course. Another thing about Saul's reign. Here's the one that you're talking about here in chapter 15. He was instructed in chapter 15. Furthermore, Saul was partially obeyed the Lord by not utterly destroying the Amalekites. He was instructed to go in chapter 15. And Samuel said unto Saul, The Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over this people, over the Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way, and when he came up out from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. And Saul gathered the people together and numbered them, and telling him 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and laid wait in the city. And Saul said unto the Canaanites, I'm going to skip down through here. Go down to verse 7. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Now, what was he supposed to do? Kill everybody. Okay? Everything. And if you look in verse 3, he was supposed to kill the ox and the sheep and the camel and the ass. Everything's supposed to be gone, right? But down here in verse 8, he saves the king. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the oxen and the fatlings and the lambs and all that was good. It would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and cried unto the Lord all night. Again, Saul has failed again. If you look down here real quickly, we're going to jump down to verse 22. Well, verse 22. Samuel points out to him, because I don't know what passage it is right off, I can't remember which one, where he hears verse 14. And Samuel said, What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? He hears the sheep, he hears the oxen. And then Saul gives more excuses again. In verse 15, and Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord and thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. But you did not obey completely. And this passage here in verse 22, what Samuel says, I think is very important. Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. He prefers that you obey him than you do bringing offerings to him. You know, that's very important. Of course, the short of this is Samuel has to he winds up killing Agag the king. Okay. But here again, Saul has failed in being the leader he's supposed to be. I'm running out of time here. This other thing about Saul's reign, in chapter, where they got it right here? Chapter 28. So we're jumping over a whole lot of time here. So chapter 28 is 1 Samuel. Chapter 28, a lot has taken place, of course. I'm not going through all that about David and being anointed and David being in the court and David and Goliath. I'm skipping all that. We'll deal with that next week, Lord willing, about David. But at this point in Saul's life here in chapter 28, excuse me, in chapter 28, verse 7 down here, he needed, I forgot to mention to you, Samuel had already passed away. Samuel had died, has been gone. So now Saul's, without Samuel helping him along. At this point in chapter 28, it says here, down here, excuse me, where's the chapter? Yeah, 1 Samuel I'm in chapter 26, wrong chapter. Chapter 28 and verse 7. Then said Saul unto his servant, Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said unto him, Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. And Saul disguised himself and put on the other raiment, and he went and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. Now, side note, you're disguising somebody who's taller than everybody else, okay? But he's taller than the servants, he's taller than everybody else. He's being disguised, okay? So he's the king being disguised. I would think he would kind of stand out. You're pretty tall, but maybe they didn't have the news outlets, all over the place, but he is disguising himself. And the woman said and he says here, and they came to the woman by night, and he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee. He's purposely going to go ask for Samuel, of course. And the woman said unto him, Behold, thou knowest that Saul, what Saul hath done, how he cut off those that have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore thou layest thou a snare for me, for my life, to cause me to die? Of course, he swears to her, Samuel swears to her, and saying, As the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. So I want to jump down here a little bit. Well, let me finish it all. And the woman said, Whom shall I bring up to thee? And he said, Bring me up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice. And the woman spake to Saul, saying, Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul. And the king said unto her, Behold, be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods descending out of the earth. And he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up, and he covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. And Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am sore distressed for the Philistines. I'm going to skip past down here. In verse 16, Then said Samuel, Wherefore then doest thou ask of me, seeing the Lord is departed from thee, and is become thine enemy? And the Lord hath done to him as he spake by me. For the Lord hath rent the kingdom out of thine hand, and give it to thy neighbor, even to David. Again, Saul was disobedient. He was not supposed to have, consult a witch. Another disobedience. Even as a leader, disobedience. His rebellion. As a king, he was fearful, he was paranoid, he was irrational. You saw those already. He was fearful of the people, fearful of the situations all the time, and how he mishandled everything. So the conclusion is, was Saul saved or was he lost? I take this quote here from Elmer Towns' book. I thought it was interesting to think about because I read somebody else talking about this situation. About was Saul a saved man, was he a lost man? I'm not going to take a poll in here. I got less than a couple of minutes here for that. But it says here, the life and death of Saul posed a very difficult question relevant to the spiritual state of the things. You can see this pretty well. You probably read it faster than I can. The summary of it was King Saul saved or lost? I'm jumping down to the next paragraph. Those who believe Saul was saved admit he was at least at best carnal, but such biblical statement as thou shalt be turned into another man. A few occasions when Saul built altars, sought the counsel of the Lord in decision making, verse 37, and ordered the destruction of the witches. He did order destruction of the witches. But here's one he went to go see sometime later on at the witch of Endor. Suggests some evidence of the existence of a spiritual relationship with God. The other side of the argument is that Saul was lost spiritually and usually points to this clearly his wrong actions in trying to kill David and Jonathan, his bad attitudes of hatred, his jealousy, his anger, his murder of the priest of Nob, the consultation with the witch of Endor, and as evidence to his unsafe state. Elmer Towns points out if he was saved or if he's lost, we don't know. And there's different angles of pointing at it. But this last paragraph I thought was interesting when he points out, perhaps the real reason it's difficult to be sure about the spiritual state of Saul is that the life of sin does what? It yields the same fruit whether the sinner is one who is unsaved or simply a carnal Christian who fails to live by faith. Can a Christian sin and walk in sin and eventually going to pay for it? Right? They're going to die. Not pay for their sins, of course. Christ paid for the sins. But what I'm saying is a Christian can sin, and Christians can do things that are wrong. Right? So we don't know. We don't know if Saul was saved or not. But throw that out there. I know I covered a whole big territory about Saul in a one lesson, but hopefully you may capture something about this guy who was the first king of Israel. Any questions, any comments?